we have agreed to extend our membership as non-voting members for a further 2 years. And we have offered to pay the EU the incredible sum of £39 billion. Time is running out for Theresa May. Our patience is exhausted. The civil servant who oversaw Project Fear was the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Jeremy Hayward, a committed supporter of the European Union. And I'll tell you this, he's still running Project Fear.
Yes.
If a civil servant crosses that line of impartiality, the honourable thing is for that civil servant to resign. It's now been revealed that David Davis and Steve Baker, the ministers for Brexit, were just shadow ministers. They put forward policies and detailed strategies in good faith, but they were just phantom strategies and phantom policies. Power lay not with those ministers, but with the civil servants, Jeremy Hayward and Ollie Robbins, who were covertly producing their own white paper. This is frankly disgraceful.
Unconstitutional.
When the Macmillan government, the Heath government and the Thatcher government negotiated in Brussels, those negotiations were always conducted by a Minister of the Crown, who reported to the Cabinet, and Theresa May must now end the duplicity that exists.
She can't.
There is duplicity at the heart of government, and nothing can change until that duplicity is removed. The Bruges Group over many years has invited speakers of the highest calibre and expertise to speak to us and to write for us. It's regrettable that none of these have ever been invited to advise our government at this crucial time. Now tonight, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome two of the most effective advocates of the benefits to be gained by leaving the European Union. Nigel Dodds is still engaged on parliamentary business at the House of Commons, but he should be here shortly. But our first speaker is Professor Patrick Minford of the Cardiff Business School. Patrick is chairman of Economists for Free Trade. He is also a prominent member of the Economists for Brexit group, which played such a key role in our campaign to leave the European Union. Patrick's analysis demonstrated that Brexit could increase the United Kingdom's GDP by nearly 7%. Why don't they just get on with it? He's also produced 2 editions of Should Britain Leave the European Union? An economic analysis of a troubled relationship. What an excellent title. Patrick has frankly been on the right side of every major economic argument for more than 30 years. He now advocates the benefits that will accrue to the United Kingdom from a unilateral declaration of free trade. Ladies and gentlemen, we are immensely grateful to Patrick for coming here this evening, and could you please welcome him into our midst.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Barry. Generous. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are certainly living in some turbulent times. Actually, I'm going to stick this microphone somewhere. I just prop it up, actually. That'll be fine. That'll be fine. Very good. Oh, brilliant. Okay. Very good. So, I'm going to talk tonight about the economics of the different options that we've considered. And I'm going to particularly talk about what I would call the WTO free trade option, which I think is increasingly likely to be the one that we adopt. And actually, as I'll explain, it is the best option. And we've said so, my colleagues on Economists of Free Trade have said so for quite a long time, but obviously, as I'll explain, it's very stupid of the EU to go that route, because they're worse off by choosing it. They would be better off with a free trade deal with us. But I think they'll discover that perhaps in a few years, and then we can help them out. So we have the Chequers plan. We have a Remain Prime Minister who has pretended to be a born-again diva and has created serious betrayal, I think, for the party she leads and a lot of leavers who trusted her. And that, I think, is a very serious situation that we're in. But that's a political matter which I'm not going to talk about, really, other than just to draw attention to it. So let's start at the beginning with why economically it is best for the UK to have a proper Brexit. I leave the European Union's institutions, which means effectively here the single market and the customs union, which are the main economic institutions of the EU. And obviously, behind all this is the desire to regain proper economic and political freedom. A situation had developed where the EU was moving towards political union, and clearly that was something that we hadn't subscribed to. I think a lot of politicians who took us into the EU maybe knew that was going to happen, but they purposely didn't really explain it to people and sort of said, well, no, it's fine, it's just a sort of union of for economic purposes between independent countries. And of course that's not what it was intended to be and what it increasingly has become. So therefore, there's also an important political dimension to the decision to leave the EU, which is political, regaining our own ability to set laws. And a democratic nation generally sets better laws than one that's ruled by people who don't really care very much about it. That's a fairly obvious principle. So it shows that in opting for Brexit, the British people actually refused to be blackmailed by Project Fear into abandoning their demand to rule themselves again, which after all is something that for centuries they've done with considerable success. But in practical terms, what we're now dealing with is the economics of the exit process and how the economic gains from leaving can be preserved. And the truth is that Brexit is not about Project Fear, it's about Project Opportunity and the future improvement of our economy due to free trade, better regulation, and control of our borders. So it isn't just about political freedom, it's also about using that political freedom to improve our economic condition. I mean, you know, people say, well, I don't really care, I pay to get political freedom. I guess we would. But the truth is, by gaining political freedom, we gain economic freedom to improve the way we do business. And in practice, the EU has been an economic disaster. The euro has destroyed several economies in Southern Europe, worst of all Greece, as we know. It was a political project which wound up in disaster. And all the proposals, constant uniformity, regulation in the interest of big business that lobby Brussels hard, social regulation, all sorts of intrusive environmental and financial regulation, all these have been disastrous economically. And so one of the things that's important about Brexit is that we use the political and economic freedom we're going to obtain to get away from all that and to make the gains from running our economy properly. And first of all, there's free trade. The EU is protectionist, highly protectionist, as President Trump has been reminding us during the last few weeks, and said actually the EU is his foe. Now what he meant was the EU is protectionist and giving me a terrible headache on trade. And he's right. The EU puts up barriers, 20% on our estimates of trade barriers, equivalent to tariffs on both food and manufacturers. So those are huge barriers, and they raise the price of food and manufacturers inside the UK and the whole of the EU by that 20%. So a big effect on prices. And so, you know, free trade will get rid of that price effect, will bring down those prices and bring produce in here to our consumers at world prices. And that will lower the consumer price index across the UK by 8%, we calculate. You know, when you allow for the way in which that fall in prices in those two key sectors will filter through the economy in various ways, particularly into the price of land, for example. So, as a result of that, you also get more competition, more efficiency, productivity rises, both in agriculture and in manufacturing, and you get resources being put into the most productive sectors of the economy. And all that free trade gives you a gain of about 4% of GDP, the part of the 7% that Barry mentioned, that we've calculated. And people say, oh, that will damage jobs. This is nonsense. We're a fully employed economy. And we have been a fully employed economy pretty much for a long time. And what happens when you get a rise in productivity and more efficiency in the economy is that people who are less needed in one sector can move to another sector where they can contribute in a different way, thus increasing the whole productivity of the economy and keeping full employment. So it's absolute nonsense about jobs. Free trade doesn't destroy jobs, it raises productivity and increases living standards. That's the point of it. And so I guess drink some water actually, because it's so hot today, isn't it? My tongue is sticking to the roof of my mouth. That's not a nice thing to happen, so I've unstuck it. So that's free trade. But you see, you can't have free trade if you stay inside the EU, inside the customs union, because the customs union is the process by which we agree to be ruled by the EU in terms of our tariffs and our non-tariff barriers, which are basically trade speak for ways of using standards to keep out goods from other countries that you don't want to come in because they're better value than your goods. So non-trade barriers, non-tariff barriers here, are the use of standards and other devices, also sometimes these anti-dumping duties, but usually it's just plain standards to keep out, to discriminate against countries that provide better goods, often in the case of the US. Often it's the US that gets most hit by these sorts of discriminations. But, so that's trade. That's the big gain from Brexit on the trade side. And obviously it's inconsistent with staying in the customs union, because if you're in the customs union, you have to have the EU's tariffs, because that's what the customs union is. They set the tariffs on your behalf against the rest of the world. So free trade means we get out of the customs union. And I really don't understand how intelligent members of the Tory party can fail to understand that free trade is good for you, creates competition, and somehow it's great to be inside the customs union. It baffles me utterly. I think they just didn't attend university and the relevant subjects. I could offer to let them come to mine, but I don't suppose they'd agree. Anyway, the second big element is regulation. And that brings us to the single market, because the single market imposes regulations across the whole of your economy in order to be in this harmonized area inside the EU where all the standards are the same, and you know, theoretically there's absolutely no barriers to moving your goods around because you're completely consistent on standards inside that single market. But the cost of that is that the whole of the economy gets regulated by the single market. Social legislation, environmental legislation, working time, health and safety. A lot of it we probably would have anyway, but there's a lot of it that's very intrusive and that really is completely unnecessary for the rest of the economy. Only 12% of our economy sells exports to the EU. The other 88% has nothing to do with the EU, but it's regulated by the single market. So if you want to have your economy deregulated and regulated according to your own pragmatic views of what should be regulated and why, you know, a sort of balance of various things that we all understand, then you have to get out of the single market, because otherwise the single market of the EU regulates the whole of your economy. And that, of course, if you can pursue your own regulation, this could bring enormous benefits to the UK, because some of the regulations from the EU have been frankly crazy. And you know, we calculated that the history of EU regulation probably lost about 6% of our GDP. Probably we could roll back about a third, that's just a guess really, of those regulations we inherited. But the biggest worry is looking ahead, because the philosophy of the EU is essentially driven by non-economic considerations. So they think regulation's a cheap way of doing political things to business. And if you have that sort of mindset, all sorts of stuff in the future could come in that we will not have to be part of if we leave. But of course, if we stay in the single market, we'll be part of it, and it'll raise our costs substantially. So we put a figure of about 2% on the gains we could get from staying out of this single market and this regulative system. But I think probably much larger than that, particularly as you look forward to areas of technology changing over the next 2 decades, which are a lot of technology change is going to happen. And unfortunately, the EU has a very bad record on dealing with technological change because it tends to regulate it out of the system and stop it happening. A very conservative approach. And so I think that the gains on the deregulation side are probably very conservatively put at 2% of GDP. And then the last word about money, of course, our contribution, which is about 12, 14 billion a year, which is not Play-Doh, is it? And then, of course, the issue of unskilled immigration, control of borders. Now, many people have said that's political. That's sort of, you know, because we don't like foreigners or something. It's absolute nonsense. The truth is it's deeply economic, because what unskilled immigration from the EU has done, a very large amounts of it, has driven down wages in poorer areas for unskilled people. It's been subsidized by the Exchequer to the tune of 20% of wages. And that's put a cost on poor people in these communities, mainly, who had to pay for unskilled workers to come in from the EU, paid them housing benefits, you know, free school places, and free health, and also all the tax credits. And that's quite a considerable amount, and it's a big burden, particularly on the poorest members of our society. So it's far from political, it's seriously economic. And we've calculated, when you put together the 8% fall in the consumer price index and the effect on unskilled wages of stopping this unskilled immigration, and also the effect on poorer communities of not having to pay the benefits for these unskilled immigrants, you get a gain to the poorest members of society of no less than 15% of their living standards. And that's pretty important to our economy and to our people. So when you add all of this together, a proper Brexit brings us that figure of roughly, say, 7% of GDP, another 0.5% growth a year over the next 15 years, big gains to consumers, even bigger proportional gains to poor people. And it's an enormously positive element. It also brings 10% more revenue to the Treasury. So the Treasury is then in a position to end austerity, go for tax cuts, and starting to do interesting instead of really annoying things to our economy, like constantly raising taxes. We can bring an end to this whole episode because Brexit will bring a large gain to the exchequer. 10% of GDP is about 80 billion a year. That's not peanuts. And we've calculated that it allows the Treasury, over the next decade, to liberalize the budget to the tune of about 25 billion a year from 2020, and another 40 billion a year from 2025, and still hit safe debt GDP targets, debt to GDP ratios of 60% by the middle 2020s. So this is what's at stake. Now, let me rapidly deal with some of the things that are now being discussed. Now, obviously, one way in which this can be preserved is to, in talking to the EU, who show themselves extraordinarily reluctant to talk to us about trade. First, they said they wouldn't talk about it until we'd offered to pay them a large sum of money. And then they said, oh, well, you know, we don't think much of any of your ideas, and we won't suggest any of our own. So, and every time that we suggested an idea, or some politician somewhere, like Mrs. May perhaps, floated an idea, they said, ha 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 ha, and things about cake and eating it. I don't know what this cake and eating it bit comes from. Anyway, they're all into that. So the thing is, unfortunately, it doesn't seem as if the most obvious solution to our relations with the EU, which would be a Canada plus trade deal, which in short means free trade like we have now with them, no tariffs, no non-tariff barriers, standards acceptable as they are now, and borders should be seamless. You know, most borders across the world are seamless, by which we mean that hardly anything is checked. It's all done computerized entry, and then checks are done in other ways. So once it arrives in port, it goes through. 98 for developed countries, the typical developed country lets 98% of its trade through its ports without checking. As Michael Caine would say, not a lot of people seem to know that. Certainly the civil servants don't seem to. So borders, and this is because the WTO, the World Trade Organization, mandates that countries should have modern borders, computerized, so that can happen. You know, all sorts of schemes like trusted trader schemes. There's all sorts of things that go on that are designed to maximize the through flow of trade at ports, what we call seamless. And the Swiss have actually put this into practice quite a lot, as have other countries. And a Swiss professor has estimated that it's about the cost to the user of this system is 0.1% of the trade flow, so basically zero. And as for standards, our standards, of course, are completely compatible already with the EU. on all goods that we export to the EU and all goods that they export to us. And one of the things that people miss in all this is that, again, the WTO rules are that standards should be non-discriminatory. And so if you satisfy the standards on a Monday, if on a Friday post-Brexit the EU suddenly says, no, 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 you don't, because now you're wicked Brits that are outside, then that's actually illegal. Because obviously, if you satisfy, I mean, if any exporting country satisfies the standards of the country into which it's exporting, and those standards don't discriminate according to World Trade Organization rules, then there's no way you can suddenly say you don't satisfy the standards. And the other point is this, that any exporter who at the moment from the UK satisfies all the EU standards, of course, because they export there, any exporter satisfies the standards of any country they export to. Obviously they must do, mustn't they? But the other point to bear in mind is that if those standards of the EU do change, then it's in the economic interests of the exporter to simply get on with it and change their own product standards too. And this will happen through ordinary commercial interest. If the UK decides to change its standards, very likely it will liberalize standards, and EU exporters will find it easy to match them because they'll be more liberal. So they'll let in more goods, including the EU ones that are already in there. But of course, if standards tighten, again, many countries change standards the whole time for various reasons. And of course, exporters match that because that's their commercial interest. So what WTO rules say is that you can't manufacture a distinction without a difference on products. If they match your standards, you've got to let them in. End of story. And, you know, if you trump up some reason because your eyes are blue or your hair is red, you go immediately to the WTO court and it overrules it. And of course, both us and the EU obey international law totally, because it's totally in our interest to do so. So, in Canada Plus, we would have the existing standards, and they could diverge over time with firms then matching them as they go over the next decade or whatever. No problems at all. No tariffs. And also the sorts of things we do at the moment in services, which basically means we carry on as before. And that seems like an extremely sensible way to go about things. And so that would be Canada Plus and would suit the EU very well, and it would suit us perfectly well. We would be outside the EU as a third country, but we would negotiate this agreement that would get rid of the trade barriers effectively. Now, as I've said, that would be in the interests of the EU, very much so. But it does seem that at the moment there's some sort of political hang-up in the EU, by which they simply won't listen to economics. They're very politicized. Now, as I don't understand politics, I won't get into that. But it's something about you Brits are a bunch of so-and-sos for leaving us, and we're going to make sure you suffer. So, that seems to be the mindset. In which case, probably Canada Plus won't happen. Which brings us to a World Trade Organization free trade arrangement, where we leave the EU under World Trade Organization rules, which I've just described to you. And you will immediately see from the description I've given that it's basically the same as Canada Plus, with one exception, that tariffs would be erected on both sides, very likely. Because the way the WTO works is, in order to do free trade agreements, you have to have some tariffs to start off with that you can exempt your free trade partners from having to pay. And politicians love free trade agreements, it makes them feel very important. personally, I guess get rid of the whole lot and say, why do we bother with this stuff? Let's just pack the politicians off to some nice home somewhere where they can do various useless things. We could short circuit the whole thing by simply going straight away to free trade, unilaterally, and simply say tariffs are waste of space and time. But I have learned from talking to politicians, they won't wear this, and they want to do free trade agreements because they think somehow that makes them important and keeps control of trade and gets them reciprocal concessions from other countries. I mean, these concessions are worthless, but from the national interest point of view, but they think that this is something important to do. So therefore, if we do go to free trade under World Trade Organization rules, what we will do is we will have the current tariffs that the EU charges as our tariffs, and we'll then, very rapidly I hope, especially with the US, do free trade agreements, US, probably Australia, and then various other countries quite quickly thereafter, which should have the effect of giving us free trade with major suppliers around the world, bringing down our food and manufacturing prices in the manner of free trade. That would be very like the free trade Brexit that I talked about. And of course the big problem there would be tariffs between us and the EU. Now, the truth is that tariffs between us and the EU damages the EU very badly, because they pay us a lot in tariffs, about 13 billion a year, much more than we pay them. Furthermore, the tariffs we pay them are not paid by us, they're paid by them. This seems paradoxical, but the reason is that there's so much competition as a result of these free trade agreements we have, that the prices ruling in the British market are pretty much fixed by world prices. So if they put tariffs on our goods, what happens is that we don't change the price we charge them, because we can't. This is the price going in our market is the price we charge. Producers can't charge any different prices because of competition. So what happens is, if they put a tariff on it, it raises the price to their own importers, so they pay it. And so the 5 billion that the EU gets from its tariffs put on our goods comes straight out of the pockets of EU citizens. And the other point is this, that because again the EU got to sell us stuff at those world prices or they won't sell anything, they can't change their prices when we put tariffs on them, so they got to absorb the tariff in their margins. And so that 13 billion that they pay us, they've got to find from their own pockets. So you can see the arithmetic here is very unfavorable to the EU, because they wind up paying 13 billion to the Treasury here. And that's quite a lot of money. Also, the EU will lose the 39 billion we told them we'd give them if they came up with a trade deal. And also Brexit would happen immediately, which is very good, because it would happen 2 years earlier. So for all these reasons, the world trade, free trade proposals are the best way to leave the EU. So they bring us not only the full 7% I talked about at the beginning, but also this tidy sum from not paying the 39 billion, from getting the 13 billion a year, and for having Brexit early. So this is actually the best way to do it. So in many ways I thank the Conservatives for their total wrecking of the whole Brexit process, because it seems to me now very likely that we will actually leave the EU on the basis of a WTO free trade deal. And this does not mean crashing out or any of this nonsense. The thing you've got to remember is that things like airplanes and all sorts of things have to be discussed between us, medicines, student exchanges, there's all sorts of things, citizens' rights, all these things are probably already agreed actually. And as you know, aeroplanes anyway is a bilateral thing, and there has to be some final tidying up. But the thing that won't go ahead is the trade aspects. We are not going to reach agreement on trade. We'll obviously reach agreement on everything else, because if we don't, our citizens and their citizens will be very pissed off. And they will tell the politicians in no uncertain terms, what do you mean I can't take my flight to London? What do you mean this? What do you mean that? What do you mean I got to pay £500 for a visa? All this sort of thing. And so none of that nonsense will happen, because of course it will make governments on both sides of the channel very unpopular. So that's what we're going to do. Now, these Chequers proposals are, of course, thanks to the wonderful actions of Jacob Rees-Mogg, dead on arrival in Brussels. But I have to say that they are the most disastrous set of proposals that you could possibly dream up. They basically keep us in the single market with the consequences I told you earlier, because the single market in goods basically covers everything else as well through all these effects on social, environmental, and all the rest of it. So, because there's also in those proposals the promise to keep standards as they are, it undercuts all our trade deals as far as standards go. And those are very important. Those are the non-tariff barriers that countries like the US are very concerned about. And so trade deals with the US, as President Trump pretty clearly said, are very jeopardized by the fact that we can't vary our standards. And it's very likely, too, that the way in which the EU will threaten us in various ways not to do things could really cramp our ability even to do any sort of trade deal, because they'll argue it's going to undermine, you know, their costs relative to us, or it's going to make us more competitive relative to them. And one of the side effects of all these Chequers proposals is to promise not to do anything to upset Europe. And of course this means we can't really do anything in the way of free trade agreements with other countries that would upset Europe. It also puts an end to all the deregulation. Almost certainly it means no freedom of migration continues, basically unchecked. And so basically, the Chequers proposals remain. They really are, effectively, remain, but as Jacob Rees-Mogg has said, as a vassal state, because we'll have no control of these rules over time as they evolve. And so the Chequers proposals are absolutely hopeless, and an astonishing betrayal of what the referendum said, as well as a damage to our Let me end there and simply say, yes, we will leave, and we will leave under, I think, World Trade Organization rules. And the World Trade Organization is a big and important body that sets international laws of commerce around the world, and is generally obeyed by all countries. We shouldn't be confused about President Trump trying to get at China and the EU by threatening all sorts of tariffs, because at the end of the day, China and the EU will undoubtedly settle with President Trump, and everything will go back under WTO rules, as in fact is in the interests of both the US, the EU, and China. So the WTO rules okay, and I strongly recommend it to you.